Hi there. Welcome. I'm so glad that you joined us today. As we've continued walking this path together, we've spent time understanding how processed foods affect the brain. We've explored why the environment around us matters so deeply, and we've begun making changes that support healing instead of constantly working against it. Today, I would like us to take the next step. Even after we've reduced cues and created more supportive surroundings, there will still be moments when a familiar craving begins to emerge. Those moments can feel discouraging. We may wonder if all of our hard work has disappeared or whether we're somehow back to where we started. But what if those moments aren't signs that we're failing? What if they're actually opportunities to practice one of the brain's most powerful learning mechanisms? Today, we're going to explore a recovery skill called pattern disruption. It's a gentle skill, but don't let its simplicity fool you. Small interruptions repeated consistently over time can begin teaching the brain that an old pattern no longer has to end up the way it always has. We're not trying to fight with our brains. We're not trying to overpower cravings through willpower. We're simply learning how to interrupt a familiar sequence long enough for something new to become possible. Before we begin, though, I'd like to invite you to take a few moments to settle into this time together. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to become fully present for the next few minutes. If you're able, allow both feet to rest comfortably on the floor and let your hands rest wherever they feel most natural. There's no special posture you need to achieve. Simply allow yourself to become comfortable. Now, bring your attention to your breathing. There's nothing that you need to change. Simply notice each breath as it comes and it goes. Take one slow, comfortable breath in and gently allow yourself to exhale. Again, breathing in comfortably and breathing out slowly. As you continue breathing, notice whether you're carrying any tension in your shoulders or your jaw or around your eyes. If you notice tension, simply allow those muscles to soften a little bit. There's nothing that you need to force, nothing you need to accomplish. For these next few minutes, you've simply given yourself permission to learn. As you settle in, I'd like you to bring one quality with you into today's lesson: curiosity. Not curiosity about getting everything right, not curiosity about whether you've succeeded or failed. Simply curiosity about yourself. Curiosity about the remarkable way your brain has learned from the experiences you've had throughout your life. And curiosity about its remarkable ability to continue to learn. As you listen today, you don't need to remember every sentence. You don't need to understand every scientific idea. Simply notice what resonates with you. Notice what reminds you of your own experience. Notice what gives you hope. Take one more slow, comfortable breath. And as you exhale, allow yourself to become fully present. And whenever you're ready, open your eyes. Let's begin. As we begin today's lesson, I'd like us to think about what usually happens during a craving. For many of us, it can feel as though cravings appear suddenly, almost without warning. One moment we're going about our day, and the next we find ourselves thinking about processed foods. It can happen while we're driving home, after a stressful conversation, when we finally sit down at the end of the day, or simply as we walk into the kitchen. Because the experience often feels so immediate, it's easy to believe that the craving simply appeared out of nowhere. But as we've learned over the past several weeks, our brains are constantly processing information long before we're consciously aware of it. They recognize familiar situations, familiar emotions, familiar places, and familiar routines. And over time, they begin connecting those experiences with responses that have been repeated again and again. By the time we become aware of a craving, the pattern has often been unfolding for several moments already. I don't say that to make the process sound discouraging. In fact, I find it deeply encouraging. One of the most important discoveries we can make in recovery is that awareness changes everything. The moment we notice that an old pattern has begun is the moment that something new becomes possible. We may not change the outcome every time. We may not even know what we want to do next. But we've moved from reacting automatically to becoming aware of what's happening. That moment of awareness isn't a small thing. It's the beginning of freedom. This is why awareness is such an important recovery skill. Before we can interrupt an old pattern, we must first have to recognize that it's happening. Awareness doesn't complete the work, but it opens the door to the work. It gives us an opportunity to pause, to become curious about what's happening, and to remember that we have choices we may not have recognized before. That's where pattern disruption begins, not with willpower or self-criticism or trying harder. It begins with noticing. Now that we've talked about awareness, let's look a little more closely at what we're actually becoming aware of. One of the most helpful things we can understand is that patterns don't usually begin with eating. By the time we reach for a highly processed food, our brains have often been moving in that direction for several moments already. The behavior is simply the last step in a sequence that may have started much earlier. Perhaps we've had a stressful conversation. Perhaps we've finished a long day of work. Perhaps we've walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, or simply found ourselves sitting in the same chair where we've eaten in the past. None of those experiences automatically lead to eating, of course. But if they've been repeated often enough, our brains may begin anticipating what's usually happened next. This is one of the remarkable things about our brains. They're always looking for patterns. They're constantly asking, often outside of our conscious awareness, what usually happens now? That ability serves us well in so many areas of life. It helps us to learn new skills, to recognize familiar faces, and to move through daily routines without having to think about each and every step. The difficulty is that our brains learn all repeated experiences, not just the ones we want them to learn. If stress has repeatedly been followed by processed foods, those experiences gradually become linked together. If a particular room, a certain time of day, or even a familiar emotion has often been followed by eating, those associations become stronger with repetition. Eventually, the brain begins anticipating the ending before the story has even unfolded. Now, I think that's an important distinction because it helps us to see that cravings rarely appear out of nowhere. They usually grow out of a sequence that our brains have learned through repetition. And that brings us back to awareness. The sooner we notice that a familiar sequence has begun, the sooner we have an opportunity to gently interrupt it. We aren't trying to stop our brains from doing what brains naturally do. We're simply giving them an opportunity to learn that this sequence no longer has to end the way it always has. Once we become aware that an old pattern has begun, we arrive at a very important moment. It may only last a few seconds, but those few seconds give us an opportunity that wasn't available before. Instead of continuing automatically down a familiar path, we have an opportunity to gently interrupt the pattern. Notice that I didn't say we have to make the craving disappear. That isn't the goal. The goal is much simpler. The goal is to interrupt the pattern before it continues automatically. One of the remarkable things about our brains is that they're constantly learning from experience. Every time a familiar pattern unfolds in exactly the same way, the brain becomes a little more confident that this is the way the pattern is supposed to work. But when something different happens, the brain pays attention. That's why even a small interruption matters. Perhaps we spend a few minutes with our community instead of remaining alone with the craving. Perhaps we read the Daily Connect newsletter and allow our attention to shift away from the thoughts that have begun gathering momentum in our brains. Perhaps we listen to a daily podcast while taking a short walk, or watch a teaching from the video library that reminds us what our brain is experiencing in that moment. The specific pattern disruptor isn't nearly as important as what it accomplishes. Instead of allowing the old pattern to continue uninterrupted, we've introduced a different experience. We've given our nervous system an opportunity to settle. We've reminded ourselves that support is available. And we've shown our brains that this familiar pattern no longer has only one possible outcome. We may not notice dramatic changes the first time we do this. In fact, many of these interruptions can feel surprisingly ordinary. But our brains learn through repetition. Every time we become aware of a pattern and gently interrupt it, we're practicing something new. Over time, those repeated experiences become part of the brain retraining process that gradually moves us toward healing and ultimately toward remission. As we continue talking about pattern disruption, I'd like us to spend a few minutes thinking about what progress really looks like. I think this is an important conversation because many of us have spent years measuring ourselves in ways that leave us feeling discouraged. We may reach the end of the day and ask ourselves whether we had a craving, whether we thought about processed foods, or whether we responded exactly the way we'd hoped. If the answer isn't what we wanted, it's easy to conclude that we haven't made much progress. But I wonder if we've been looking for progress in the wrong place. As we've been learning, our brains change through repetition. They don't suddenly forget patterns that have been strengthened over months or years. They gradually learn new ones through repeated experiences. That means the earliest signs of brain retraining are often much quieter than we expect. They don't usually arrive as dramatic breakthroughs. More often, they begin with awareness. Perhaps we notice a familiar pattern a little bit sooner than we did before. Perhaps we recognize the beginning of a craving while it's still gathering momentum instead of after it's already carried us into an old habit. Perhaps we remember that support is available through our community and choose to spend a few minutes listening to a grounded voice, reading the Daily Connect, listening to the daily podcast, or watching a teaching from the video library. None of those moments may seem especially dramatic, and yet each one represents something important. Instead of allowing the pattern to continue without interruption, we've introduced a different experience. And I think that's worth celebrating. Every time we become aware of a pattern, we create an opportunity to interrupt it. Every time we interrupt the pattern, we're giving our brains another opportunity to learn. We may not notice a dramatic difference after one interruption or even after several, but our brains are always paying attention to repeated experiences. Little by little, those interruptions begin teaching the brain that the familiar pattern is no longer the only response available. And that's why I don't think success is measured by whether we had a craving today. I think success is better measured by whether awareness is growing. Are we noticing sooner? Are we becoming more familiar with our own patterns? Are we remembering that we have choices? Are we beginning to reach for the support we've been building instead of allowing the pattern to continue automatically? Those aren't small changes. They are some of the earliest signs that brain retraining is taking place. So perhaps this week, rather than asking, did I have a craving today? We might ask a different question. What did I notice today that I might not have noticed a few weeks ago? I think that's a much kinder question. It's also more accurate because it helps us to recognize the quieter changes that often come before the larger ones. Those moments of awareness, repeated over time, are part of the process that gradually moves us toward remission. Once we become aware that a familiar pattern has begun, we have an opportunity to introduce something that wasn't there before. That something doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to make the craving disappear. Its purpose is much simpler. Its purpose is to interrupt the pattern by giving our brains a different experience. One of the remarkable things about our brains is that they're always learning from what happens next. If the same situation has been followed by the same response hundreds of times, the brain gradually comes to expect that response. That expectation becomes part of the pattern itself. When something different happens instead, the brain takes notice. This is one of the reasons our community offers so many different ways to stay connected throughout the day. There are times when spending a few minutes on ARC TV may be exactly what we need. At other times, we may find it helpful to read the Daily Connect newsletter, or listen to the daily podcast, or spend a few minutes with a teaching from the video library. There may be moments when stepping outside for a short walk, changing our surroundings, or simply taking a few slow breaths creates enough space for the nervous system to begin settling. Although those experiences may look quite different from one another, they all have something important in common. They gently interrupt the pattern that was already beginning to unfold. Instead of allowing the brain to continue down a familiar pathway without interruption, they introduce a different experience, one that's calmer, more supportive, and more intentional. I think that's an important distinction because it reminds us that we're not trying to win a battle against cravings. We're helping our brains learn through new experiences. Every time we interrupt a familiar pattern with an experience that brings support, connection, or calm, we're strengthening the very pathways we've been trying to build. Over time, those experiences begin to accumulate. One interruption may not seem especially significant, but our brains don't learn from one interruption. They learn from repeated interruptions. Little by little, the new pattern becomes more familiar. The nervous system begins settling more easily. Awareness comes more quickly. And what once required tremendous effort gradually begins to feel more natural. That's how brain retraining works. It happens one pattern at a time, one interruption at a time, and one new experience at a time. As we begin practicing pattern disruption, I'd like us to spend a few minutes talking about what progress is likely to look like. One of the reasons I think this conversation is so important is because many of us have spent years measuring ourselves in ways that naturally lead to discouragement. We learn a new skill, we understand why it works, and then we quietly expect ourselves to begin using it perfectly. And when that doesn't happen, it's easy to wonder whether we really learned anything at all. I don't think that's an unusual response. In fact, I think it's one of the most common experiences people have whenever they begin learning a new way of responding. We leave a lesson feeling encouraged because everything makes sense. And then a few days later, we find ourselves in the middle of a familiar pattern before we even remember that we wanted to do something differently. By the time awareness arrives, the pattern has already unfolded, and it can be tempting to conclude that we've somehow missed our opportunity. But I wonder if that's really the best way to understand what just happened. If our brains learn through repetition, then it probably isn't reasonable to expect patterns that have been strengthened over months or years to change simply because we now understand them differently. Understanding is certainly important, but understanding alone isn't what retrains the brain. Our brains learn through experience, and every opportunity to notice a pattern, even if we don't notice it until later, is another opportunity to understand it a little more clearly. Instead of asking why we didn't interrupt the pattern sooner, perhaps we can become curious about when the pattern actually began. What was happening just before the craving gathered momentum? Was there a particular thought or emotion, place, or situation that quietly set the pattern in motion before we became aware of it? Those questions move us in a very different direction from self criticism. They move us toward understanding. And understanding is one of the most valuable things we can gain because every new insight makes it a little easier to recognize the pattern the next time it begins. Little by little, awareness begins arriving sooner. Little by little, the opportunity to interrupt the pattern becomes more available. Little by little, our brains begin learning that another response is possible. I think this is one of the reasons awareness deserves to be celebrated. It's evidence that something is already changing. We're becoming more familiar with our own patterns, and that growing familiarity gives us more opportunities to gently interrupt them. Every interruption, no matter how small it may seem, gives the brain another opportunity to learn through a different experience. We may not notice dramatic changes after one interruption or even after several, but our brains are always paying attention to repeated experience. Over time, those repeated interruptions begin strengthening new pathways, while the old patterns gradually lose their influence. So, perhaps as we practice the skill during the coming week, we can measure our progress a little differently. Instead of asking ourselves whether we had a craving today, perhaps we can simply ask, what did I notice today that I might have not noticed before? I think that's a much kinder question, and it's also a much more accurate one. It helps us to recognize the quieter signs of growth that often come before the larger ones. And it reminds us that brain retraining happens one pattern, one interruption, and one moment of awareness at a time. As we bring today's lesson to a close, I'd like to leave you with one simple invitation for the coming week. Not a challenge to do this perfectly, not a goal of interrupting every pattern, simply an invitation to become a little more curious about your own experience. As you move through your days, I wonder what you might begin noticing now that you weren't aware of before. Perhaps you'll recognize that a familiar pattern often begins at the same time each day. Perhaps you'll discover that certain emotions tend to come just before thoughts about processed foods begin appearing. Or perhaps you'll notice that there are particular places or routines or situations that quietly invite the pattern to begin unfolding. There's no need to judge any of those observations. We're simply gathering information. The more familiar we become with our own patterns, the easier it becomes to recognize them while they're still unfolding. And when awareness arrives a little sooner, we create another opportunity to gently interrupt the pattern before it simply continues in the direction our brains have learned to expect. There are many ways to create that interruption. Sometimes it may be spending a few minutes with our community. Sometimes it may be reading the Daily Connect, or listening to the daily podcast, or watching a teaching from the video library. And at other times, it may simply be stepping away from the situation for a few moments, taking a few slow breaths, or changing our surroundings long enough for the nervous system to begin settling again. The important thing isn't choosing the perfect pattern disruptor. The important thing is remembering that we don't have to allow the pattern to continue without interruption. Every interruption, no matter how ordinary it may seem, is another opportunity for the brain to learn through a different experience. And because our brains learn through repetition, those experiences begin accumulating in ways we often don't notice from one day to the next. Looking back several weeks or several months later, we may discover that awareness is arriving more quickly and that patterns are becoming easier to recognize and that interrupting them feels a little more natural than it once did. I think that's one of the most encouraging aspects of brain retraining. We don't have to create dramatic change all at once. We simply continue practicing one moment of awareness at a time, trusting that our brains are learning through every experience that we repeat. Those quiet moments of noticing, interrupting, and beginning again may not feel remarkable when they happen, but over time they become the very experiences that move us toward remission. Before we finish today, I'd like to invite you to take a few quiet moments to reflect on what we've been exploring together. If it feels comfortable, allow your body to settle into the chair beneath you. You might gently close your eyes or simply soften your gaze. There's nowhere else that you need to be for these next few moments. Nothing you need to accomplish, nothing you need to figure out. Simply allow yourself to become fully present. Let's begin with one slow, comfortable breath, breathing in gently and breathing out slowly. Again, allowing the breath to arrive naturally and allowing the exhale to become just a little longer than the inhale. As your breathing settles into its own comfortable rhythm, simply notice what is happening within you right now. Perhaps you notice the feeling of the chair supporting your body. Perhaps you notice the temperature of the air against your skin. Perhaps you notice the gentle movement of your breathing. There's nothing to change, Nothing to improve, only noticing. As we sit together for these few minutes, I'd like you to bring to mind one familiar pattern you've become aware of during today's lesson. There's no need to judge or analyze it. Simply acknowledge that it exists. Our brains learn patterns because that's what healthy brains are designed to do. The pattern itself is not a reason for shame. It's simply something we're learning to understand more clearly. Now, as you continue breathing comfortably, imagine yourself noticing that pattern the next time it begins to unfold. You don't have to imagine changing it perfectly. Just imagine becoming aware a little bit sooner than before. Imagine recognizing that familiar moment and quietly saying to yourself, I notice what's happening. Take another slow breath. As awareness grows, choices begin to appear. Take another gentle breath. As we interrupt familiar patterns, our brains begin learning something new. One final breath. With patience, repetition, and support, our brains continue moving toward healing and remission. Take a moment to notice how your body feels right now. Perhaps nothing feels very different. Perhaps you notice a little bit more calm. Perhaps you notice that you've taken a few moments to care for yourself today. Whatever you notice, it's perfectly enough. When you're ready, gently bring your attention back to the room around you, noticing the sounds nearby, noticing the chair beneath you, taking one final comfortable breath, and slowly open your eyes. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I look forward to continuing this journey with you. As we come to the end of today's lesson, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Pattern disruption isn't about becoming a different person overnight. It's about becoming a little more aware today than we were yesterday. It's about learning to recognize the familiar patterns our brains have developed and gently interrupting them with patience, compassion, and the support that surrounds us in this community. I hope you'll remember that awareness is never a sign that something is wrong. Awareness is one of the earliest signs that something is changing. Every pattern you notice, every gentle interruption you make, and every time you choose to reconnect with the support available through this community is another opportunity for your brain to learn through a different experience. Please don't underestimate those moments simply because they seem small. Our brains learn through repetition, and it's often the smallest experiences repeated consistently over time that lead to the most meaningful changes. Those changes may be almost invisible from one day to the next, but they're quietly building upon one another as your brain continues learning new patterns. As you move through the coming week, I hope you'll simply remain curious. Notice what you notice. Observe your patterns with kindness. And celebrate each moment of awareness because every one of those moments is part of the brain retraining process that gradually moves us toward remission. Thank you for spending this time with me today. It's a real privilege to be part of your journey, and I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation in the next lesson when we'll explore another important aspect of helping the brain heal and settle into new patterns. Until then, take good care of yourself, and I'll see you again soon.